Mr. Bencomo, you're a gun owner yourself. I'm going to assume you're a law-abiding one. Has Colorado's law been tied to mass confiscation of firearms from gun owners like yourself?
First of all, I am definitely a responsible gun owner, so thank you. And from what we know from today, obviously I'm not a scholar or a lawyer or an attorney, we have not seen mass confiscations. One area that we could do an improvement, I was glad to hear that we hit the high marks on that we're a good role model. Not only do we have defense lawyers, I would love to see federal funding so that we can ensure that there's PSAs, public safety announcements, and education for the additional responsible gun owners of Colorado.
Are you familiar with instances where it's been used to retaliate against people or vindictively by family members or business associates against each other?
I am not.
And it's been about a year since Colorado's law has been in effect, correct?
That is correct.
Notwithstanding that some counties have declared themselves to be Second Amendment sanctuaries, and some sheriffs have announced plans to block the law from being used, I understand quite a few have reversed their opposition after seeing how the law is actually put into effect. Is that correct?
That is correct, and those citations are listed in my written testimony. I wouldn't be able to speak to them today, but they are listed.
Well, I thank you for coming here and talking about how it has saved veterans' lives, because they are at risk of suicide, and this law obviously has worked effectively to protect them. Mr. Horowitz, Mr. Koppel referred to your statute as one that seems to have been framed to meet the due process standard, and that it is based on the best examples of laws throughout the country. And he alluded to the resources necessary to implement such a law. Would a law from Congress that provided those resources and training encourage states to adopt the best kind of standards as you have advocated?
I think the federal government could do a lot to encourage the proper standards for these laws. I do think we've seen, and Kim Wyatt is the best example of what her unit does, but where there is robust funding, you'll see all sorts of services for getting these done, but also for the respondents and the petitioners. But what you don't see is that, for instance, outside of King County, where Ms. Wyatt works, the implementation is really different. And so what we're seeking is those federal resources to make sure that the same processes that we've seen work in Washington, well, in King County, can do in every county that needs this. And I will say that suicide, and from my testimony, you know that I care a lot about this. Some of the highest suicide rates are in rural counties who are least able to afford the types of training, the types of investments that other counties have done. So I think as a suicide prevention tool, I think the federal government has a big role to play in providing that technical assistance, that training, and the resources to really develop a process so things don't fall through the cracks. But there's also the types of services that would make this really work.
We've been talking a little bit about the protective orders, domestic violence protective orders. They impose restraints on constitutional rights, do they not?
They certainly do, well beyond what a extreme risk protection order does. So domestic violence restraining orders can often keep you from your bank account, from your kids, from your home, and in some states, even on a temporary basis, your firearms. So what we're talking about here is just one slice of that, but based on the same standard. It's a very surgical type of tool here. And that's the point of this. And I was glad to see Mr. Koppel talking about ways that we can agree on this, because I do think we can do that. I think we can get there. I think we can make this tool safe to use around the country. I think we can meet and come to the middle and find agreement and make sure that we're saving lives.
I was encouraged as well, quite honestly, by his statement to that effect. And I thank him for his his testimony today, but also his candor in describing what he knows and what he doesn't know, because not all of us are experts on all the facets of these laws. But just from a constitutional standpoint, the restraints on liberty involved in domestic violence orders, in fact, they are called restraining orders because they restrict liberty. The civil commitment statute, which takes away potentially somebody's liberty. There are all kinds of ways in which those fundamental liberties are impinged to keep society safe, and they establish procedures to do it so that those orders are fact-based, and a burden of showing those facts is put on the person who would seek to take away that liberty or any other rights. And that basic concept is what we have here. And the idea that an order expires if it is unchallenged or unverified within a period of time, and a firearm is then returned, certainly is a source of protection, is it not?
It is, and as Mr. Kopel said, we really believe that at the end of the order, the firearm should be returned. It should not be a complicated process. There are options to renew, but at the same burden as the original. It doesn't. The burden should not shift from the petitioner in those circumstances. If there's a renewal petition made, it should again be on the petitioner to plead the elements of the statute.
And in a certain sense, we can actually not only encourage states to adopt these kinds of statutes, but also elevate the levels, the quality of those statutes if we offer incentives for them to do it in the form of grants and other support.
Right. I mean, as Senator Cruz said, the states are all over, are the laboratories of democracy, and there's different processes in different states. And I think you're starting to see some, a coalescing around some of the best practices there. And hopefully the federal funding could really improve that and make that, continue to make that process, that coalescing develop, so that the law, we learn for what the best practices are. We learn from people like Kim Wyatt what really works, and that we end up developing a program that saves lives across the country.
I think, Ms. Wyatt, I asked you earlier about the importance of resources to your unit, and you have a very well-staffed unit with experts and prosecutors and so forth, which has costs. Could you talk a little bit about the value that federal resources would have to help you implement the best practices of that unit?
Sure, and just to give a little context, we are evolving as our unit has grown since January of 2018. Last year in 2020, we had, I believe, 73 law enforcement petitions, ERPOs, and 6 were from families. So we realize on a daily basis the need to educate the public and educate the community, from faith leaders to school officials, therapists, medical providers, law enforcement throughout the whole state, and federal authorities or federal law enforcement as well. So there's a need overall to educate the public, because if you have a law and nobody knows about it, then it's not doing any of us any good. So that would be the number one thing, is to get a public education out. And then the second thing I think is really critically important is to have funding for individuals who are implementing ERPO laws in their state, or to be able to create a model policy for law enforcement. So law enforcement understands how are we supposed to serve these orders, which are very similar to other civil protection orders. But once we created a model policy and assisted law enforcement in our county, we had much more buy-in from our local law enforcement, because it was this tangible, attainable task. So I would suggest doing some of those things, but education is the number one thing. And then the second is to bring all the system players together, so that folks from the clerk's office where the orders are going to be filed, to victim advocates who may be reaching out to families to also guide their loved one who's in crisis to get some resources. I think that's critically important. And one area where we lack in our state is the need to have some money for individuals that are subject to the ERPO who need a behavioral health evaluation. funding is needed to be able to guide those individuals, to be able to get that evaluation if it's court ordered, and to be able to get them some help once they've been subject to one of these orders. I think that's critically important.
Thank you very much. I'm going to yield to Senator Cruz. I have a few final questions, but in case he has to leave, I'll yield to him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a